If you're a corporate treasurer looking to start a treasury transformation journey, this episode is a great start for you. I'm Muhammad Kurtam, and this is the Mia Treasurers podcast. Roshan, great to have you. Thank you for joining me. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I know it's going to be a lot of excitement in this discussion, a lot of interesting stuff that we're going to discuss about the transformation. But first, let's start with introduction, your background, your current role, and your path through Treasury in the region.
Amazing. Thanks for having me. Really happy to be here. I've been Treasury pretty much all of my career. I moved to the region in 2014 with a company called Reckitt Benckiser. Fantastic role. I was looking after emerging markets. I had a lot of responsibility for Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and Asia Pac. Around about 75 countries that I was responsible for. Really interesting role, kind of bridging the sort of gap between the head office function as well as the local sort of markets, supporting them on all the treasury aspects that they were working on, from FX, cash management, and other sort of treasury solutions. I had 5 really good years there. I then moved to Mantrack, which is a Caterpillar dealer, as group treasurer. Again, really interesting role. We're going to be talking a lot about, what I was working on at Mantrack here today. But that was effectively responsible for the treasury function, insurance, trade finance, as well as customer financing. So quite a broad role, a lot of really interesting things. The company as well, it's a private institution, but behaves very, very similar to a multinational corporation. But yeah, very interesting. And then currently I'm at Agility. I've been there for just under 7 months. Supporting the treasurer on financing activities, as well as, moving to a transformation journey at Agility as well.
Yeah, so I think most of our discussion today will be around your role in Mantrack. You spent in Mantrack almost 5 years.
Yes.
And I think I was one of the lucky people who joined you partially in this region, in this journey. And I have witnessed the great transformation that you did in the treasury function in Mantrack. So before we go into the transformation, you basically, from scratch, you implemented the TMS, you build a shared service center for the treasury team. So before we go into the process and how we did this and how you did this, walk me through the challenges that were there in the status quo treasury department back then, in reporting and reconciliation. The main triggers that you said, you know what, I need to go through a transformation. I need to have a Treasury Management System. I need to maybe have a shared service center. So walk me through the challenges, the triggers for that.
Perfect. Yeah. So one of the big drivers for taking the role at Mantrack was the state of the treasury function when I joined. There wasn't much, in terms of visibility, controls, all of those other aspects. So Treasury was basically run by Excel. There's no treasury policy, very weak processes, no real visibility on cash, FX. The territories or in-country teams were really banking with who they liked. So there needed to be a lot more, I would say, efficiencies and other controls brought. It's public knowledge, but there was a large fraud before I joined where a significant amount of money was stolen. Via sort of hacking and fraud around that. So my fundamental sort of, day one CFO, this is what you need to do, is to bring in some controls, bring in some policies, and effectively bring in a framework that Treasury can then, work from going forward. So, the prerequisites, if you can imagine not having the processes and policies in place, getting those built in, ensuring that you've got the right setup, the right level of control from head office to the countries in terms of what they're doing. So that kind of was the starting point, and they were the sort of areas with major focus and that kind of started and prompted the discussions for the Treasury transformation journey. So from a TMS perspective, that would help from bringing us from kind of the manual processes, the Excel driving, getting the visibility, more integration with our banks, more connectivity with our banks. And then the shared service center, which culminated after the TMS implementation, would then bring a more centralized function. So, once you brought in, streamlined processes and everyone doing the same process, being able to centralize and having more visibility around that was one of the drivers on the shared service, as well as, bringing in efficiencies around staffing numbers, cost control, by having something centralized.
Yeah, so I think this mainly discussion around the governance, and I understand that treasury management system, given that it's very processed, when you're doing a payment, you have to go through the appropriate payment authorization and also the access of the TMS itself. It's very secured in terms you need a two-way authentication, for example, etc. I had a really interesting discussion in my last podcast with Mustafa from Kariba Treasury Management System, which outlines all the aspects around the Treasury Management System and how it can be secure for your governance, etc. When you're implementing for payments and the visibility of cash. I will put a link somewhere for whomever is watching the YouTube for this podcast. But this is on the governance side. Let's speak more on the technical reporting reconciliation. I would imagine things were before the transformation were more Excel-like, more manual-like.
100%.
So,
Yeah. So
yeah.
everything was manual. So everything from cash forecasting, reconciliation, all driven by Excel. You talked about payments as well. The payment process was typically uploading, manually keying into e-banking systems. So from the perspective of running a group treasury, having accurate data, visibility on data is really important, because a lot of what we do in treasury is actually using that data to make decisions. If you don't have the basics, cash position, knowing where your cash is, what you have, with each bank across the group, FX sort of visibility, there's not a lot you can do from decisions. And what I felt, when joining, this treasury function was most of their day was spent actually gathering the data. And we had a very, very small time for actually making decisions. And I can kind of give an example. So in Nigeria, they were using 19 banks. And out of those 19 banks, around about 10 of them weren't even sharing MT940s. They weren't even sharing statements. So in the morning, the treasury analyst would come in. He would have, 10 statements where he'd have to log into each of the individual e-banking systems. The others, who'd be on the phone to the bank, trying to get the bank statement, trying to get the cash position. By the time it got to 1 o'clock, he's finally worked out what the cash balance is. And then a lot of the cutoff times have passed. So actually, to move cash between the banks or to put money on deposit, you're kind of working T-1. You've always got to build in a day. So you come in on Monday, we find out your position, all your decisions then made on Tuesday with almost old data. And that's just one example. And you can imagine this is going on everywhere. So, a lot of this whole transformation was actually, looking at some of the banking infrastructure. So another sort of prerequisite is, ensuring we had, some of the right banking group in place, ensuring we're using the right banks or having the right infrastructure locally.
I remember one of the things that also links to the automation. I remember when we were doing the FX deals, we used to do this over the phone. That's number one. That's before the transformation. We used to do it over the phone. And for the tracking wise, I used an Excel sheet. So every time we do a deal over the phone, I would put the deal reference, the bank, the rate, the date of the hedge, all of the data manually on an Excel sheet. And we need to track all the deals that we do on the Excel sheet. And we have Excel sheets by month, and it was all over the place. And then when we started implementing the TMS and we linked it to our FX platform, which we were using FXall back then, everything, number one, you no longer do deals over the phone. You just do it on FXall and you get the best quote. Number two, the deal flows automatically to the TMS, so you don't need to put anything manually. Number three, you get the appropriate approval, because on TMS or FXall, you need an approver who authorize based on the limit of the deal or the amount of the deal to do this deal beforehand. So it's more secure, more robust, easy to track. So this is one of the things also I noticed, because I was really lucky to work with you back then. I noticed while the transformation helped in. So yeah, I think this is really showed the core triggers for the transformation and why transformation was very, very important at this stage. I think one of the main questions that a lot of treasurers ask is, okay, if I want to start a transformation process, maybe implementing a TMS or a shared service center, this has a cost. It has an explicit cost. It has also an implicit cost. But when it comes to the explicit cost, the actual costs of paying the TMS or paying the vendor, regardless which vendor is and which tool you're going to use, making the appeal for the top management, CEO or CFO, etc., and showing the ROI. This is the tricky question. How do we do that? How do we approach that? How did you approach it in your transformation, for example?
Yeah, so I was lucky in a way, given what had gone on before I joined, with the money loss for the company. I think the CFO was already sold that he needed something, right? So even through the interview process prior to joining, TMS was discussed. We need to get, better controls in, better processes, more efficiencies. So part of my job had really already been done in the sense that the CFO knew he needed a system. I think the next step really, we had to put together a business case, and the way that I looked at it, you've got your cost of the TMS, as you highlighted. There is a cost to the company for implementing systems. You've got your annual licensing fee as well as the implementation cost. So that's effectively what our challenge is. The way we then tried to counteract that challenge was by looking at what the value add would be from the system. So what savings we could make by implementing a system. And this can be very, very simple, by looking at what cash balances you have left in country. If I go back to my Nigeria example, if you can imagine at any point in time, you've got cash sat there, not working, not being placed on deposit. If you looked at that around the whole group, by having almost instant visibility when you come in the morning to make decisions, one of your cost benefits is being able to get either additional yield from placing on deposit or paying back borrowings, repaying debt. So that was one of the time savings. You talked about FX all. If you're doing phone dealing or you haven't got visibility of your FX positions, one, you could just be really inefficient with your FX hedging, potentially having, foreign currency at month end, having revaluation impacts. Having visibility on that, you can at least make decisions around keeping your FX under control, as well as getting, competitive pricing on the platform. So there's many things that we looked at from a cost saving. The other bit, which in the business case was probably the largest component, was the time saving. Because for me, and a lot of people look at, putting in a TMS, we're trying to cut down the team, reduce staffing levels. We didn't necessarily look at it that way. We looked at it as if you've got an analyst working for 4 hours every day doing manual reconciliation, and you can, turn that into a 15-minute task in the morning. That gives them 3.5, 4 hours to actually work on something else, something that can add a lot more value. And, this was a big piece of the business case, because the Treasury Management System implementation, and I probably should have said this earlier, it wasn't just a head office implementation. We did it company-wide, okay? So at group treasury level, we used the TMS. All the in-country teams also used the TMS. So whatever we were doing at corporate, the in-country guys were also doing, which was great, because it meant that if we were doing our daily recs or we were doing our cash management, daily positioning, so were the rest of the company. And by putting it company-wide, everyone was kind of seeing the efficiencies. And in the business case, we were getting on to like thousands of hours, of saving just by bringing in this TMS. And that enabled us to look at other value-add things like, doing our bank RFPs, looking at net working capital solutions. We had the time to kind of spend on other things. So that was kind of the second category. And then the third category is the area where you can't put a cost saving necessarily. You can't put a time saving necessarily, but it's just, I would say, the subjective items, which by having better controls, better processes, you're de-risking the department. Okay. So if we go back to the case of, fraud risk, I can't say to the CFO, I'm going to save you 10 million a year for the fraud, right? I can't say there's going to be a time saving, but having that ability to kind of sleep better at night, knowing that, things are in a better place is also another aspect to put to the business case. So if I add those three things, that was effectively our business case. So you had the cost going out, your cost saving from some of the solutions we're going to put in, time saving, and things you just can't put a price on. And that was effectively how, we got the sign off for the TMS implementation, and then later on the shared service center. And to talk a little bit about the shared service center, that was almost kind of the icing on the cake, because the TMS had given us that sort of platform, to, put these changes in place, ensure that we've got best in class processes, procedures, ensuring that everyone's working, to the same sort of formats and reporting lines and things like this. What the shared service center now enabled us to do was to bring in a centralized team who could take that pain away from kind of the local market. So, some of our countries, for example, some were larger in size and they had 3 or 4 sort of treasury people on the ground. Some were smaller. So you may have had half a head, kind of looking at treasury, as a part-time job with kind of accountancy, credit control. What the shared service center enabled us to do was to allow the businesses to focus on what they should be doing, which is selling to customers, growing the business, becoming more profitable. And all that sort of back office processes, reconciliation, other things like that were then centralized. So it kind of just gave a clear sort of dynamic between what we should be doing at head office and what the country should be doing locally. And that kind of then gave us the further efficiencies and other cost savings.
And this links to the time aspect, cost aspect you were speaking about, because I've witnessed that once we had the shared service center and we had a team dedicated to basically pool all the transactions for all the countries into one team, one place, and one system. Now you're basically giving more time to the local teams to focus on the main business needs and business strategic decisions, if I might say. So even from a group treasury perspective, as a team here based in Dubai, we had more time looking at top level discussions. Okay, if we have a specific board meeting that we need to take care of the analysis for it or have some reports for it, it saved us a lot of time. It made us focus on how we can refine that, how we can give better insight to the top management, because we have more time on our hands now that all the transactional work now becomes smoother with the TMS and now becomes centralized with the shared service center team. You have basically more time on your hand to present or do more critical task, which is presenting dashboards and reports to the top management in a way that will help them take the right decisions. So this is something I really felt when it comes to the idea of saving time. Now, let's walk through maybe the next step is what prerequisites and resources that you needed beforehand to start this transformation. And where did you start with the resources? What resources you already had in hand that help you? And which resources that you needed to add on top of that?
Yeah, so very good question. I mean, if I start from, I would say, the prerequisites from a treasury perspective first, because as we implemented the TMS, if you don't have, and I talked about it earlier, the right banking infrastructure, the right processes in place already, it's very, very difficult to kind of convert what is effectively an Excel run process into a TMS. So we spent 6 months prior to the TMS implementation primarily looking at the banking group. And when I joined, the company was using over 90 banks. You can imagine like the from a treasury management perspective, cash management perspective, very, very complex. From the accounting team perspective, you can imagine like the reconciliation they're doing, audits, all of these things. So what we effectively did, and what I brought in was a 2-bank model in each country. So we effectively did RFPs in all of our 16 jurisdictions, and we chose the banks which could offer us the best sort of solutions, treasury solutions on the ground, best sort of digital capabilities, and I would say had more sort of knowledge and experience in connecting multinational corporates, right? So they were kind of the 3 things that primarily we looked for. Cost was also important, but you could look for a really inexpensive bank. If they can't integrate, if they have manual controls, you'd rather pay actually a little bit more to ensure you've got that sort of digital capability. So we spent a good 6 months doing these RFPs in each of the markets. We reduced our bank accounts from something like 700 odd accounts to less than 300 by doing this exercise, because once we had chosen our kind of primary and secondary banks, all of the banks outside of that were effectively closed down. There were some bigger jurisdictions and more complex jurisdictions where we decided to keep additional banks. Egypt and Nigeria are probably good examples where, at the time there was Forex, challenges, a lot of LC requirements where probably 2 banks couldn't handle that. So in those markets specifically, we ended up going for a 5-bank model. But that was a real driver, because once that banking infrastructure had been rectified, we could then look at things like cash pooling in some of the markets. We put in a centralized cash pool at head office to kind of bring cash into the right place, automated sweeping in some of our jurisdictions as well. And that kind of gave us, I would say, a good starting point, because when you're implementing the TMS, the fewer accounts you have, the easier it is to integrate. The fewer banks you have, the easier it is to integrate. So that was kind of step 1. And then we decided on our payment banks that we were going to use as well. So typically our payment banks were sort of international banks in a lot of these markets. And we brought that down to between sort of 8 and 10 payment banks across the group as well. So that was kind of first and fundamental from a banking perspective. Then we looked at ourselves a bit more internally. So I talked around the fact there wasn't a treasury policy, there wasn't defined processes in place. Each country was, reporting its FX slightly differently, doing their cash management slightly differently. So what we brought in at the center was a treasury policy, which effectively drove all of that governance that we were expecting across the company, so that everyone was effectively, on the same page when it came to how they should approach treasury sort of risks, as well as other financial risks, and really kind of, set in stone what we were expecting. And that covered everything. That covered the expectation around how we made payments. So across the group, a lot of checks being issued, a lot of manual payments, so letters being written to banks. We brought in, policies to say that all payments should be made electronically, unless there's an exception from group treasury. And there's always going to be exceptions, but it's reducing those exceptions rather than having it as the norm. So that's just one example. Things around, how they manage their cash, how much you should be placing on deposit, what the maximum cash balance should be locally. So we set restrictions to say that no country should be holding more than $2 million. So that started, coming on to things like repatriation, and actually ensuring that, dividends are being repatriated, which brings other benefits as well. So all of these things were kind of started as a scratch. And then we looked at, other processes around like payment processes, how we do our reconciliation. And that drove kind of some of the reports that we were then expecting to have as part of the TMS. So in one way, we had the policy written, knowing that we'd have a TMS to come in, which would enable us to track that policy, and in order to ensure that we have the output that was expected from the policy. So that was kind of our sort of groundwork that we had put in before the TMS. The TMS we selected as well, and I mean this in the nicest way, it wasn't a TMS that you could absolutely customize to the nth degree. Okay, so within it, there was best practices, but you couldn't go too out of scope. So there's some TMSs out there where you can customize absolutely everything. I didn't necessarily want that, because if I'd opened up the door for every business to customize its own process, every department we're working with to customize their process, you then get to a point where it becomes quite difficult to kind of bring in that overall control. So we ensured that the TMS kind of almost had a built-in workflow. There were certain things you could change, but it didn't necessarily completely change the overall sort of picture of it. And that's what we wanted. So to give an example, the payment process is relatively set. Okay, so you build in your SSIs into the system. We actually, from a treasury perspective, you'll probably remember this, we were also in charge of third-party payments. It wasn't just treasury payments. We also had the responsibility for vendor payments as well. So the controls around that needed to be very rigid. So we had things like procurement were the only department who had access to putting in bank account details as well as SSIs. So we kind of had that segregation of duties. We would then effectively have the accounting team would effectively directly connect from the ERP to the TMS the payments that were being entered into. The approval process was then with Treasury and senior management, and then we then looked at the release. We had built that so that we had these segregations, and in other examples, we could have customized that a lot, but we actually kept it pretty much how the system had designed it.
So I think it's very interesting because you've laid it out very nicely in terms of prerequisites. So if I can summarize, and please stop me and correct me if I'm wrong. First thing you need to do, you need to limit the banks as much as you can, because it makes it easier for you from a control perspective, right? Risk perspective, and from TMS implementation perspective. So you need to limit the banks that are capable to connect to your TMS, that are capable to cater for your business, your specific needs. So that's number one. Working on your bank's relationship and limit the banks that you work with to the ones that you absolutely need for the transformation. Number two is have a policy in place, policy not just for governance, but a policy that makes sense for the TMS and transformation. Policy that is written, that is makes things easier for you once you start the transformation. So the second step is having the policy. And then I think the third step, as what you discussed, is finally choosing the TMS that you want to do. And when you choose the TMS, two main things you need to take into consideration: the level of controls that you want to have, and the level of customization that you need as per your business. Right? Have I?
Yeah, no, perfect. Exactly. And that sort of third step is very dependent on the company, I feel. And I think if you'd already had a TMS in place and you were implementing a new one, perhaps you want something a little bit more customizable. But for us, going from Excel, we wanted something pretty rigid. I think the only bit I've not mentioned, and you asked me within the question, is about around the resourcing. Okay, so once we've selected the TMS, it was very important that we had the resource in order to kind of implement that. So there was a cost constraint around resourcing. So there was a lot around the existing Treasury team really did have to pick up a lot of I would say, the heavy lifting. I did hire one new joiner who had very, very good experience in kind of the back office processes and aspects around that. But it's really the core five of us were effectively the ones that were implementing the TMS, and it was part of our day job, right? Nothing else could be put on pause. We had to kind of manage and get that in. So I think what the outside of the Treasury team, real key for me was having dedicated IT resource. What you'll find is a lot of the TMS providers, what they kind of bake into the contract is if there's any delays from kind of corporate side, there can be overrun costs, there can be other things that are chargeable. So one really good decision we made was to have one dedicated IT resource who was fully working on the TMS. And that was vital because you never know when something's going to come up. You could be integrating a bank and suddenly we need support on, the file type that we're discussing and trying to implement into the system. You've got other things like, we put in the chart of accounts into the system. So when we did the auto reconciliation, those reconciling GL entries ended up going into the ERP. You needed IT resource as well as accounting resource to kind of support on that. And I was very lucky in the sense that because it was a major project for the company, we had the buy-in of the CFO, we had the buy-in of internal audit, group financial controller, CIO. All of these people were absolutely bought into the process. So we had the steering committees in place. We had all of these sort of toll gates and expectations that each of these departments had on the project, which meant that if I needed something, I didn't have any delays. I almost had, resource straight away to kind of get things moving. And that was one of the major things why we didn't go over budget and we finished on time, because we had those sort of core team coming in.
That's a very interesting point, because usually when people think about resources, they say, okay, the first thing that comes to mind, oh, we need to hire this, this, and that for this position. We need an IT person. We need another junior analyst to support on the implementation. But they forget the main resource who's in the business, which is the business top management, the business director. So you need to have the buy-in of the finance director or the finance manager. You need to have the buy-in of your CFO. These are the main resources, because these are the ones who are going to support you and push you into having a successful transformation. So that's your main resource when you start thinking about it. The next step I want to go through is the implementation process. So maybe we can go through the timeline from the start to finish, how the implementation was like, and timeline wise.
Yeah, perfect. So I'll probably break this into kind of 3 parts. I've already talked about the prerequisites. So from the fundamental phase 1 of the Treasury Management System was getting the banks integrated from a cash management perspective. So it was really cash visibility, cash management. We then looked at our daily reconciliation. And then we looked at kind of deal input into the system. So ensuring that we were tracking our loans, deposits, trade finance, other bilateral facilities that we had. So that was really our phase 1. And that was, for me, sort of the core treasury aspects, right? That there were the areas that gave us visibility of cash transactions and, the starting point to, potential payments that we would need to make out of the TMS. That was kind of phase 1, very, very high level. Phase 2, we then connected the accounting. So all of the connections to the ERP came in. We then had payments. We had our hedge accounting or mark to market. And then finally the reporting. So that's how we split up the 2 phases of the TMS. And then finally, the 3rd phase was then the shared service center, which brought all of that together. So some of those back office functions, reconciliation, the daily cash management, deal entry into the system, which is a trade finance, loan book, were all effectively run by the shared service center. So then what we were left is at the center was basically decisions based on that data. Okay, so cash forecasting, decisions around how we structure our debt, decisions around how we would effectively ensure repatriation from our markets, as well as our forecasting for bigger things around our business modeling and aspects around that as well, and then all the reporting that then went into the board, into the monthly management meetings as well. So that was kind of how we split it up. So it's kind of getting to the detail now. So if I go back to kind of phase 1, this whole first step is where I think the prerequisite work we did was vital because we knew what banks we were going to integrate. We'd already had discussions with the banks. They all knew this was coming because as part of our questions on the RFP, we talked about integration, what file formats they could share with us and aspects around that. So it was almost like we'd already gone out to the market, letting them know what we were doing. So that first connectivity, having the bank accounts reduced, having good static data. I mean, no one really thinks about static data. Okay. If you don't know how many bank accounts you've got, if you don't know your company structure, what legal entity structures you've got, it's very, very difficult to then build that into a system. We had all of that in a really consistent format, which ensured that once we'd started putting this data into the TMS, all that connectivity just works, right? Because we knew that this account was linked to this country, this business, and it just works from that sort of connectivity perspective. So the first thing we looked at was the MT940s, getting statements into the system. For some of the banks that we used very frequently and the head office accounts where we needed to get intraday visibility, we also brought in MT942s. So that was our fundamentals. We're now getting balance reporting in. We could finally see our cash position. And we got to a point where we had 97% visibility on all of our cash across the group. There's a couple of banks that we had to keep in jurisdictions like Iraq, where we just literally couldn't connect with them. I think there's one or two in Nigeria potentially. But that was a really good starting point to go from almost 0 to 97% connectivity. So we've got full visibility. Then the next step was, now we've got balances coming in, we've got transactional data coming in. It was then making sure that we're doing our reconciliation. And Treasury reconciliation, I think, it doesn't need to be massively complex, but I think it's a fundamental control point. And what I used to say to the team is, okay, if you've made 10 payments in a day, the following day, if you see 9 transactions on your bank statement, it means straight away one of those transactions has failed. You go and investigate. If you see 11 payments, I mean, something's gone wrong. Something's gone out of the account that you're not ready for or weren't aware of. So having those sort of just key controls, which if you go back to the payment fraud, we would have known within 24 hours something had gone wrong. And there's a lot that can be done within the first sort of 12 to 24 hours if you notice that funds are missing, right? You can go to your bank and say, I don't recognize this transaction. Whereas, a lot of companies who are doing their reconciliation at month end, you can imagine if something goes wrong on day 1 or day 2 in the month, sometimes they're not finding out until working day 5 of the following month. And you've literally got no way of ever getting those funds back. It's just too long. So that was the next stage, getting reconciliation under control. So we had cash visibility. We had, visibility over our transactions that were going through. And then we started looking at things like the deal entry. To your point, if you've got an Excel spreadsheet with your FX deals on, I mean, you've all seen Excel sheets get corrupted, lose data. And fundamentally, if you're tracking your loans or FX on an Excel spreadsheet, someone will forget to make a payment. Suddenly there's interest due or a principal amount due. And that's what was happening. So next stage is really getting this detail in the system. You can then look at, some reporting which shows your maturity ladder. You can see what payments need to be made. And you've got another control just to protect or prevent anything being missed. So that was really kind of phase 1 and just getting, that sort of prerequisites in. And then phase 2 really built on that. Okay. So you've got your core data in the system. As part of this reconciliation, we agreed with the accounting team that we were going to start sending GL entries to the ERP. So if we were doing a reconciliation, so we can see it on our bank statement, we can see it within the Treasury Management System, we just send the file to the accounting team. So what it meant was not only are we doing our Treasury reconciliation daily, the accountants are actually doing their sort of balance sheet recs daily as well, which meant that the month-end process was much more streamlined because 95% of all the transactions have already been reconciled. And you just got the final 5%, which could be things that, it could be customer receipts that need to be, matched against the customers. All of these things which you can actually, save till month end and not have the rest of the noise from that. So that was really the first point of sort of phase 2. We then started linking into payments. So now we've got all of our data. We're tracking our loans. We're tracking FX. We're doing our intercompany movements, intercompany loans. We can then start making payments on the back of that. We've got integration with the ERP. So we've now got our third-party vendor payments coming into the system, which allow us now to effectively make those payments from a system as well and centralize things. And then finally, all the reporting that comes from it. So this is a massive thing that, from a control perspective, then links it to the Treasury policy. So if the Treasury policy says you must be making electronic payments, and there shouldn't be any, there are exceptions, but that should be reduced. We now have a way of tracking it within the TMS, because every day we do the daily reconciliation. If we see a payment that's not in the TMS, that's appeared on the bank statement, we know that that's either gone through e-banking or through a check or through a manual process. So it actually gave us a way of actually looking and seeing, whether the countries were actually following policy. So we had exceptions reports that we could then bring in. Things like unreconciled items, we could bring in reports that then showed us that. So it kind of gave us, and I hate to use the term, almost like a big brother. We could actually then make sure that, things were being followed, because there's no point putting in a policy if you're not going to follow it. You're actually wasting everyone's time by even putting the policy in place. And this is really where we started seeing the maximum efficiencies, right? Because if you know that someone is following a process and they're not doing something as a manual workaround, you know that some of these efficiencies and time savings are coming out, and you can almost nip it in the bud, in the sense that if someone isn't following the process, you can then kind of redirect. So that brings me on to kind of the third sort of phase of the shared service center. So now I think, and I'm trying to recall the timings here, I think we gave the Treasury Management System around about 6 months to kind of bed in, everyone around the group to kind of get used to the processes. Obviously, we had a UAT process before we went live to make sure that everything was working as expected. But we actually, started challenging ourselves around giving ourselves KPIs on what auto reconciliation targets we should have. We wanted to have less than 5% of all of our payments to be made outside of the TMS. So every single month, we were getting better and better and better. We reached a point after about 6 months where we had pretty much reached to the, I would say, as close to the final state as we could in terms of maximizing efficiency. And this is when we started then looking at the shared service center. The big prerequisite from the shared service center was staff. Okay, so we decided to have our shared service center in Alexandria in Egypt. And we needed to ensure that we had the talent and the expertise, to kind of help with that. So what we had done for some of the senior positions, we had moved across people from head office who kind of knew the processes, who had effectively been using the system. But what we decided to do was actually, from a treasury perspective, we went out and hired 8 or 9 fresh graduates. And that was fantastic because, and look, I'm very passionate about treasury. I don't necessarily think treasury is rocket science, but what I look for in kind of a new joiner or prospective sort of treasury candidate is actually just having a bit of enthusiasm. You can sense that someone's hardworking and asking questions, being curious about stuff. And those sort of 3 things can get you relatively far. You have to be honest. You've got to have your integrity as well, which is very, very important within the treasury function. But we had a surplus of that in Alexandria. There was a big university there, and we actually ended up getting some really good graduates in. Because these processes and procedures were quite new to the company, I'd literally just put these things in place. It kind of made sense to have employees who were learning the best practices straight away. Because one of the ideas would be, okay, why not bring people in the company who'd been there 2 or 3 years? I was worried that they knew all the old processes, right? And as a company, there was people who'd been there 20, 30 years. You can imagine if you've been doing something for 20 years in a set way, suddenly I come in and you've got a new process in place. So I thought, having that sort of, fresh ideas, fresh thoughts would be a great way of doing it. So we ended up doing a train the trainer approach where we taught all of these 8, guys and girls around how it would all work and how we wanted the system to run. We split it into time zones. So out of each of the jurisdictions, we had half the team looking at, 8 countries kind of in the Western Hemisphere, 8 in the Eastern Hemisphere. We had a couple of markets that were working on Sundays, whereas the others were Monday to Friday. So we put in almost like a rota system. So we kind of had half-day staff on Sunday and Friday. So we knew that the business was completely covered from a time zone perspective. So we put a load of work in just to ensure that, these processes were then being centralized. And then it was the handover. So making sure that, someone who had been working in Ghana, who knew the details on how the Ghanaian banking system worked, what we put through each bank account, we actually had, training sessions around the specifics of each of the market. So we ran both of these shared service center and the in-country teams in parallel for about 6 months. And then that was it. We went live on the shared service.
Roshan, this is the most structured answer I ever received for any question.
Oh, good.
This is stunning. I'm stunned. So I'm really impressed. Of course, I was lucky to be part of the process, so I've seen that. But the way you explain it now, and now everything fits nicely in my head from what I have seen. But just to summarize, so you have basically 3 phases. Phase 1 is the bank integration, reconciliation, and financial transactions on the system. And then phase 2, you link to the ERP, mark-to-market valuation and reporting. And then the phase 3, which took place 6 months after phase 1 and phase 2, just to make sure that everyone is familiar with the TMS, we've tested everything out, we have the right controls. We started phase 3, which is the service center team, which you started from scratch in Alexandria. And I do agree with you. Having new blood come in with fresh ideas and fresh aspects to things or perspective to things is sometimes easier and simpler and quicker to have than having someone there with the stigma of the status quo and trying to change it. So I do agree with that. The last thing I want to touch in, maybe we can mention one of the challenges that you faced during the implementation, maybe perhaps COVID, and how did you tackle that?
Yeah, that was a major challenge on the implementation, COVID, right in the middle of the TMS. So, so we tackled it. I mean, look, ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, the TMS implementation was group wide. Okay, so we had close to 100 people on the system, so across the 16 countries. So we were having to do a lot of the data entry, some of the setup of the TMS, as well as the training remotely. But when COVID came in, it effectively meant that our TMS consultants, because some were based in India, could then fly over for some of the face-to-face training. Of course, I had planned to go out to each of the countries, do some training face-to-face, really talk them through, the expectations around this, get the buy-in locally. Couldn't do that. So a lot of it we had to just do on good old Teams, right? So we set up, webinars. We put in sort of structured training on each of the modules. So we'd have a cash management training for kind of Western Hemisphere, Eastern Hemisphere, a lot of repeating of it, but that was good in a way because the more we did things, the more training we did, the more questions we got. The team were wonderful because it was a very interactive session. It wasn't like I was just talking to a brick wall and no one was getting integrated. It was really, really good, really good. So we kind of learned from these training sessions and how we could kind of make it better by the end of it. I think the big challenge doing things remotely was the UAT. So when we're doing like the acceptance testing, this was when we had multiple departments. So it wasn't just Treasury doing the testing. We could, for example, manage.
What's the acceptance testing?
So the acceptance testing is making sure that the TMS is behaving as you wish for it to behave, and all of your setup then works and doesn't create any challenges. So, for example, your UAT on payments, you would make sure that if you put a payment in, no one can go in and edit that payment or manipulate the payment before it goes. You're testing the controls around it. So is that payment picking up the SSIs? Is the payment, for example, going through the right approval process? So if it's $1 million payment, it's not accidentally going to someone whose payment approval limit is only 50,000. So literally every single component of a process is then tested, recorded, not just in one place. You have to do it in all of the locations to make it thorough. You then make sure that these payments are going to the bank. There's no delays. It's a huge project. And this on its own can take a month, just going through each of these cycles, making sure the reporting is showing. So you can look at it from a Treasury perspective. A lot of it is deal entry and making sure that, our flows are working. But when you start involving other departments, okay, are the GLs coming? Does it match exactly to the chart of accounts? You've got an accounting side. You then potentially got an IT side, because if it isn't working, why is it not working? Is it because someone's configured it wrong? Is it because one system isn't talking to another? And that problem solving remotely can be challenging. And what we had wanted to do was get the core team in one location. So it could have been Treasury, Finance, IT, all in one location. Remotely, people are doing the testing, but doing that sort of problem solving and getting into the detail around how to resolve some of these challenges centrally. That couldn't happen because of the travel ban. But we made the best of it, right? And I think, one of the things that we did very well as a business was, during these sort of times where things aren't behaving as normal, it kind of really brought everyone together to try and, get these things sort of finalized. And timing was very, very lucky because we'd actually done a lot of the implementation prior to COVID actually coming on. So it was lucky, because if we had been in the old world where everything was done by Excel, we didn't have cash visit. You could imagine entering into a situation like COVID where people are working from home, suddenly you don't have access to your systems, you don't know who to contact. We were very, very lucky we actually did the implementation when we did, because it meant that, from that business continuity perspective, we were very well covered. So yeah, small problem, but we got around it.
That's very interesting. I think before we close, I have one last question for you. If you had to go through this again, just tell me one thing you would do differently.
One thing I'd do differently if I were to do it again. Look, you can always learn from TMS implementations, right? I've done 3 or 4 in my career, and every single time I've done one, my role within the TMS implementations or transformation projects has always been slightly different. Okay. So when I first came into Treasury, I was someone in the back office helping with the implementation, trying to do the reporting. So I wasn't leading the direction, but I was, part of the team kind of driving it. And as I've got, further in my career, and I'm now, project leads or driving the project itself, one thing that I've always learned from, and I think on this project, is the prerequisites. Okay. So I firmly believe in doing that, actually spending the time ensuring that you have that infrastructure in place. Because if you don't, it will just delay things. And with any TMS, if things are delayed, it's ultimately going to cost you more money, and it's going to take a lot more time, because any small thing that has been missed in the blueprint stage or the development stage ultimately comes back to bite you. So I think in my mind, it's being very, very clear with what you want your bank infrastructure to look like, what you want your processes to look like, what you want as a final output, and then everything else will broadly come together. I think if I were to change one thing, what would I change? I think it went relatively well. There are certain things perhaps with integration in certain jurisdictions where, if you had known the challenges beforehand, you may tweak the order slightly. Okay, so
a bit of preparation, maybe more into the preparation even before the prerequisites.
Perhaps. I mean, the way we tried to look at it was we would try to do some of the easier markets first and maybe leave some of the more complex markets to the end because we wanted to keep that traction going. There is an argument for maybe doing the more complex ones first. Because in the complex markets where, maybe banking regulations are slightly tighter, the actual, the ways of working is slightly different. And I'll go back to the example of Nigeria and Egypt, where we had huge trade business, just giving the amount of LCs and bank guarantees we needed to do. Maybe start with those markets because you're likely to face challenges which can then help with some of the easier markets. If you save them to the end, you get all projects, you get tired on these projects, right? As these things, I mean, this is only 1 year when you look at the actual TMS piece. You can imagine after a year, working pretty long days, pretty intense, I think you kind of get a bit weary. So I would say maybe doing it in a slightly different order. But hindsight is also a wonderful thing as well. Sometimes you don't realize this until you're actually in the project.
Sometimes surprises are nice. They are not always that bad. So.
Yeah.
Listen, I really enjoyed the discussion. I think it was really well structured and I loved it. And even though I went through a lot of it together, it just fits nicely now after the discussion. So thanks a lot, Roshan, for doing this. And thanks a lot for being my guest today. One more thing before you go. I got you this. It's a small thing. You can open it.
Wow, thank you.
I know you not really into Bitcoin. I tried to lure you in a lot. So what I wanted to do is to get you the smallest Bitcoin book I can find. Literally, it's named The Little Bitcoin
Incredible.
Book.
Amazing.
So hopefully this maybe would be a trigger for you maybe accepting Bitcoin.
Have I got in too late though?
No, it's never too late. It's never too late. But listen, it has been a huge joy for me having you. Thanks a lot again. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you,
Thanks
Roshan.
very much. Cheers.